everybody, and welcome to masinahikan iskwêwak. My name is Kayla, and I am one of the co-podcasters. I don't think we ever decided what we actually call ourselves. Podcasters for this podcast about Indigenous women publishing and Indigenous publishing worlds. And I'm here with only one of my co-host podcasters today.
You sound so sad.
I am sad.
We miss Sheila a lot.
Yeah, Sheila's not here. She's at Back to Batosh this week, which is awesome. If any of our listeners out there have not heard of what Back to Batosh is, definitely look it up. And if you're a Métis person, definitely go. Next year is the 50 year of Back to Batosh, so I want to see all my relatives out there. I'm trying to get together a slow pitch team. So if
Métis slow pitch team.
Métis slow pitch team. So if anyone wants to be on the Bookwoman slow pitch team,
hell yeah.
Yeah. Let's do it.
It's really sad that Sheila's not here because I know that she was actually, this was one of the interviews that she was looking forward to the most.
Oh, no.
But she did send me a couple of questions, so I can ask them and frame it in a Sheila-esque kind of way.
Great, and maybe we'll pretend we're talking to Sheila.
Yes,
in that
we can pretend. Yeah,
be like,
we'll
Sheila, that's an incredible question.
Oh my God!
Do you want to introduce yourself?
So I am Tanya. I am one of the co-hosts of the podcast. Again, Sheila's not here today, but we'll be missing her, and we are here with our guests. I'm not going to introduce you. I'll let you introduce yourself because I don't want to fuck it up. Go ahead. Yeah, whoever wants to go first.
Okay, I'll go first. Tonse, Molly Swain Nitsigason, Otuskonik Nitotsen. My name is Molly Swain. I'm a Métis woman, originally from Calgary, Alberta. I am a co-host of Otopemsu Iskwêwak Gitsikisakuk Métis in Space. And I'm also a PhD student in the Faculty of Native Studies here at the U of A.
All right, thank you for that, because otherwise I would not know what information I should be divulging about myself.
Oh yeah, I just like freestyled it.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
Chelsea Val Nitsigason Mantusak Eigenik Nitotsin, Maga Niwigin Uta Amatsquatsi Waska Eigenik Anots, Negotwasek Nitotansen, Egua Outpemsu Esqueo Umania, Apo Apidgosan Esqueo Umania. So I'm from Lac Saint Anne, Métis, got 6 daughters, and I'm always stressed and exhausted because of that. What do? I am a eternal master student. I feel like I'm never going to finish my thesis ever. I think that's like what a lot of grad students feel like.
Yes.
Molly lapped me and is doing her PhD, and I'm so grateful that I am not doing my PhD. It's a wonderful freedom. And I also am a Cree instructor at the Faculty of Native Studies, and I do odd and end sorts of things there too. I don't really know what I do.
You also co-host this podcast.
Oh yeah, I'm a co-host for the podcast.
Yeah. You do
everything.
Everything.
I do everything and nothing.
Hustle. Like when you're hustling, like and just
that
bring in paychecks
100%.
random. Yes,
it's true.
All those little side jobs.
Yeah, the side hustle is real.
Just keep it coming. Yeah.
So we invited you both today to talk about your amazing podcast.
Hooray.
Because as we all know, storytelling takes place in many different forms and mediums, graphic novels, books, oral storytelling. We've explored a bunch of them in our podcast, but can you tell us a little bit about your Métis in Space?
Yeah, so we do a lot of different things. Sort of on its face, sort of the bulk of what we do is Chelsea and I sit down, we drink a bottle of red wine, and we watch some kind of film or television episode that's within the speculative fiction genre, so that's science fiction, fantasy, and horror. And the episode or film has to have something to do with Indigenous people. And there's weirdly a lot of it. And then we sit down and we talk about what that representation looks like. So what the representation is, what the narratives are like, the treatment of Indigenous people and Indigenous themes in speculative fiction.
And then we also do a lot of world building. So it wasn't enough to just like sort of do a critique of these things. We decided that we also wanted to create a universe for Métis in Space to exist in. And we did so by like rejecting apocalypse and deciding that the future we want to see doesn't have to happen because things get so immeasurably horrific that, like everything ends and we have to start anew. We decided that we could actually create futures that are based on good things. So we think about if we could have anything we wanted, we didn't have to explain the steps of how to get there. What would a decolonized future look like for us? And so that allowed us to sort of cast our minds into the future in a way that I think a lot of Indigenous peoples don't get to, because we're just always dealing with the day-to-day, survival and reaction to whatever trauma is happening in the moment. And so we've done it in a few different kind of fun ways. And that's kind of like my favorite part about it is when we brainstorm up these ridiculous, sometimes not always working little things that we insert into the episodes. We haven't really done much this episode, but
this season we're just getting
this
started.
Season,
yeah, we just recorded our 3rd episode of the 5th season, so we're still ramping up with it.
Yeah, we went real hard at first. We recorded all the time, and then academia really sort of slowed things down.
Yeah, it really did
a lot.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, but I mean that's okay. One of my favorite things about the podcast is that we're not beholden to anybody. Mm-hmm. We are part of the Indian and Cowboy podcasting network with Ryan McMahon, but he has been very, very hands-off in the best way. He's very supportive in the ways that we need support, and he resources us when we need resources, but he doesn't make us stick to a schedule. He doesn't ask us, he asks us the just most bare minimum stuff. Yeah. He basically is really there to just support the work that we do, but aside from that, we don't do advertising, we don't do Patreon stuff, we don't
improve our production value at all. It's the same shitty production value since day one.
Yeah.
We are legit.
But I think part of that means that we have the freedom to do whatever we want with it. We can say whatever we want, we can try new things whenever we want, and some things people really love, some things we don't get a lot of feedback on, but to us it doesn't matter. Our number one sort of bottom line is that we are doing it as long as it's fun, and if it stops being fun, we stop doing it. Which means that if we start feeling like we're getting in a bit of a rut, which has happened a few times, we're okay, how do we make this fun for ourselves?
Yeah.
And we can do whatever we want, and we don't have to worry about what other people are going to think about it, because we didn't think anybody was going to listen anyway.
Yeah, exactly.
So what's the recipe for more fun? Is it more wine?
Sometimes it's more wine. Or sometimes it's when Chelsea was pregnant. She's been pregnant twice. Since we've started doing this. So when Chelsea's pregnant, we find sort of themed cocktails, and we'll make Chelsea the virgin version of the cocktail, and then I'll have the full on version. So for a while we were doing that. That was kind of fun.
It's the guests. I think when people are in town, we have our buds usually as guests.
Yeah, the storytelling that we do, that world building Chelsea was talking about.
Fun.
We've had Dispatches from the Future, which is ourselves living in the decolonial future. Something happens, right? So great sci-fi is it's about how we all live together, right? It asks these big, important questions about life and about the nature of existing and relating to one another. And so we tried to do some of that stuff, and of course, keep it light and funny and be real style. But so we have Dispatches from the Future, which is we're telling ourselves in the contemporary time sort of what's going on in the future. We've had
Girl Champlain. I love that so much.
Where one of Chelsea's daughters played this new colonizing alien who
just
sort of takes on this
every time
of this girl Champlain and tries to recolonize the Métis spaceship.
She was so amazing.
We've been doing some sort of interesting sort of alternate dimension, thinking through sort of alternate dimension stuff. We had Ask Amunia, which was our first one, which we had to stop doing because it became too relatable for white people.
Yeah. Once satire is too close to truth, it's not good satire anymore.
Once they the white people stop being mad about it and start loving it, we're move on. Yeah. So just it's stuff like that, and podcasting as a genre is really, really amazing because it's incredibly dynamic, right? I think it really takes up the tradition of sort of public radio, which a lot of Indigenous people are still really committed to, especially in sort of more rural areas. So anything you can do with radio, you can do with podcasting and more. We've done movies, we've done agony at columns, we've done blog posts.
There's now that chapter in 150 Years Retold that's based in the Métis in Space universe, and we're working on a graphic novel.
Yeah, so it's
wild.
It's this weird thing because it's Chelsea and I were basically just having this sad summer one time, and then all of a sudden we're doing graphic novel and living our dreams and just having a really fun time with it. So
So how did you come up with Métis in Space? Were you just sitting around one day and you're like, hey, let's do a podcast? Or was it
literally? Yeah.
Nice.
Yeah, we're just sitting there watching something and talking about it and ripping it apart and laughing and being like, we're so funny. We should record this. This is great. We're the funniest people on Earth. And let's call it Métis in Space. And then 3 days later, it was done.
Literally
our first
3 days
episode.
later, we recorded our first episode. And actually, it was really good timing because Ryan McMahon, who's sort of the grandpappy of Indigenous podcasting with his Red Man Laughing podcast, he had just released his big How to podcast, which goes from conception to publishing to RSS feeds to advertising to, he goes into massive detail about all of this stuff. So we'd both listened to this and we're like, we ain't gonna do that.
Yeah.
And then we could listen to our jokes all the time and keep laughing at them.
Seriously, I often put on Métis in Space, especially the first season I really I often put it on when I'm doing household chores. Yeah. And then because it's been a while since I've listened to it, you know, something will come up, like the joke will get set up, and then I'll say the joke, and then a second later, the recorded me will say the joke, and I'm like, oh my God, so funny.
I still got it.
I just like cackle to it so hard. It's great.
Yeah, but I mean, I think, you know, that's one of the things that when we're talking about podcasting, we really like to underscore is that it's almost criminally easy to do. Like, if we can do it, you know, like we had neither of us had any background in recording. Like, you know, we did that thing, you know, when you first start hearing your own recorded voice, we were both like,
it's super weird.
You know, like, I can't believe we sound like that, right? We had no experience. Nothing with audio recording software, audio production work, audio editing, obviously not websites, SoundCloud. We had to learn SoundCloud on the go.
God,
we set up a Twitter for, you know, like we didn't, but we managed to put out something that even with our like basically $0 budget and total lack of experience sounds not terrible. You know, and we just went from there. So.
I mean, there have been a few people who are like, I can't even listen to this. The production value is so low. And I'm like, see ya.
Sorry.
Yeah, no one's forcing you here. But man, does that ever sound
That's how we actually sound. We are low production value.
Tell me about it. Like, we have recorded from everywhere, from like the middle of nowhere to like sometimes here at work and like just holding up in places, and you know how it's supposed to be like quiet and stuff.
Whatever.
Like in the episode with Josh, his kid was like playing the drums in the background, and awesome. Tanya's mom's dogs were barking, and
I love that.
And we're like, what are we gonna do?
Yeah, we get like
can't
Chelsea's
go re-record.
kids.
But that's indigenous practice, right? We don't separate ourselves from our families and our communities, and so like you can hear throughout, like you hear my kids growing throughout the seasons, like from like literally being like a little baby in the room to just like a few chirps to like they're running around and stomping on our heads, like when we're recording in the basement, and all that's part of like our actual life, and people don't like it, like then I don't care.
Part of the thing too is, you know, you listen to a podcast like Serial or This American Life or something, they have teams of people, right? They have teams of people researching the content, professional hosts, professional producers, all of this stuff. And like, if that's what you want to listen to, that's great. But, you know, none of us can afford that kind of, like, we're indigenous podcasters. You think anybody's throwing money at us?
Yeah.
Especially the stuff that, like, we say?
That we do? No shit.
Yeah. Like, I really like Last Podcast on the Left, but I'm like, they probably have, like, a huge team that's behind them, and they have, like, a beautiful website and all this merch, and I'm like, we're just exploring kind of merch right now, and I'm like, how do we do this the cheapest that's not going to come out of our own pocket? Yeah.
Well, a lot of them, too, are produced by CBC. I know a couple of them.
That's right,
I mean, The Secret Life of Canada are now funded by CBC, are they not? I can't remember.
Know.
But anyways, if you don't mind, can we take a little rewind? I know we were talking a lot about the podcast, but we're all talking about relationality here. I'm a huge relationship person. So how did your friendship happen? Like, I mean, how did you end up together and then making this podcast?
It was a bit weird, actually. So I was following Chelsea's blog for a while, and I was like, wow, Chelsea Vowel, so cool. She's living in Montreal. I'm living in Montreal. We'll probably never run into each other.
I'm pretty sure I did see you a couple times at First People's House, because I basically lived there the first year I was there.
Yeah, we probably did, but I was kind of like, whoa. And but then, so Chelsea on her Twitter put out she wanted to move, and she was looking for a new apartment, and it was a big place. And it just so happened that I was living in this walk-up in Verdun, and the place below me was the exact size that she was looking for. So I was like, look, I don't know if you're interested in moving to Verdun, but like, here's the number, check it out. And Chelsea liked it and moved in.
Yeah.
And so we became neighbors.
Yeah.
And I was like, neighbors! I was like so in. I was like 100% in. I was like, there's another Métis from Alberta living below me in this like hellscape of Montreal. Like, we're going to be friends. We're going to be neighbors.
And we knew a lot of the same people anyway. That's
we did.
We totally had a lot of friends in common. And it turned out like, so we were in Montreal, but we kind of like were in with this like expat Cree Métis like prairie group. You know, just all these, like, it's funny how I went and I became friends with people who, like, I hadn't met in Alberta, but we're from the same places.
Yeah, you're sort of in these territories that aren't your own, that are, like, so drastically different, feel really, really isolating because you're, like, away from all of your relations and just surrounded by this really intense sort of, like, francophone sovereignty BS all the time. And so it's, like, you start to, like, you just gravitate towards
prairie people who, like, make fun because we come from the prairies where, like, if you don't make fun, there's no fun.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Isn't that the truth, eh?
Yeah.
Everybody like a big city like Toronto and stuff, they're like, oh, I need the fun to come to me. And we're like, that's not how shit works out here.
No,
like,
there's not enough fun if you like expect the city to give you fun, you know? But yeah, and then of course Chelsea like had this like big family that eventually started growing and stuff, and I was still an undergrad, so at McGill, so everybody, I was the oldest person there, and I started when I was only 22, and I was the oldest person that I knew in undergrad.
So weird. Yeah.
And so it's all of these sort of like mostly upper middle class white students
learning to do their
in
laundry
arts.
for the first time. Like literally, that was a complaint I heard. I was like in a law. I went into law school after I graduated from law from here. My exit strategy to move to Montreal was like I was gonna get my civil law in Quebec because they have a different system. But anyway, whatever. Long story short, I'm sitting there with all these fucking 17 and 18-year-olds, and they're like, "Oh my god, it took me so long to figure out how to do my own laundry. My mom won't do it anymore." And I was like, "Die."
Yeah.
Privilege.
Yeah.
That is what privilege is.
Yeah, but it also means that there's no other generations. It means that everybody is between the ages of 18 and 25, which is, I think, a deeply unnatural and like harmful experience. I think it's really, really, and you never get that in Indigenous communities, right? And you don't, like, even in our faculty, right? We have students that are a lot older. We have students that bring their kids in, which is like a much more natural situation. So the fact that Chelsea had this big family and was like living a real life, I was like, oh, thank God, kids. Oh my God, I was like, I need to hang out all the time. Yeah. And that just, it just felt a lot more normal to have that around.
Yeah, I think I've definitely found, like, within the Faculty of Native Studies, a lot of people that now are almost like family and not just friends that I hang out with all the time and have been invited to like their kids' weddings and stuff like that, and when they have grandkids, just hanging out with them and holding babies and doing stuff.
I know, I love it. Every time somebody comes in with the baby stroller, I'm like, baby.
Yeah.
I'm making little graspy hands.
You have to stop at our office now.
Yeah. Normally I'm not like babies, but I'm like, oh, you have children that can talk to me and like hang out and maybe play with bubbles. Like, I don't know. Tanya's just like Tanya's kids, when they're like tiny, I'm like, you're delicate and you don't do much. What am I going to do with you? That's fair. Like, when they get to be able to run around and have fun, that's more when like Auntie Kayla comes swooping in.
Right.
Until Auntie Kayla has to auntie out and be like, don't eat my pickles. Like,
not me, man. I'll hold all the random babies. Yeah. The babies just come to me.
Yeah.
That's
amazing.
Yeah, you like the babies.
Baby
give me the older kids.
I am. Yeah. That's what. Sorry. Side note. At Lac St. Anne, there was this random kid that walked up to us with a wagon, and there was a baby in the wagon, and this kid started talking to me, and she's like, "Hey, my name is so and so. This is my sister so and so. Do you want to hold her?" I'm like, what?
Yes.
Yes, I do want to hold your little sister.
That was from the same family that I had to auntie out on her little brother because he was like, I like pickles, and then went into my cooler and tried to eat my pickles that were in my cooler.
That's
I
amazing.
was like, don't eat my pickles.
Mm-hmm.
I was like,
also,
if you
can I just
asked,
appreciate that kids
like I was like, if you could have asked, you could have had some pickles, but you didn't ask, so don't eat my pickles.
No, the stolen pickles are always tastier.
And I was like, just don't. I only had like 4 of them, and I was like, don't eat my pickles.
That's amazing.
And then of course everybody was laughing.
So I'm looking at Sheila's question here because she's not here. She texted me this morning and she said, oh, she also wanted me to tell you this. This is in Sheila. Quotation. I found Métis in space when I was first listening to podcasts and I was living in Toronto, and her mind was blown when she found you. Oh, she's...
Thank you,
really
not Sheila.
You're welcome. I'm also not Sheila. But I mean, we kind of asked this question already, but she said she wants to know what sparked the idea of having the podcast, so... I don't know if you wanted to add anything else a little bit more.
I honestly think we were kind of just doing it anyway. Like we'd get together. Montreal, at least our communities in Montreal, were very, very into visiting in a way that I think even more so than in Edmonton.
Yeah, it's weird.
Which is strange. Yeah, so we were always visiting with one another. It was summer. I was really underemployed. Chelsea was teaching at the time, so she was off.
Yeah.
So we both had a lot of free time. So I spent a lot of time just at her place. We'd make ourselves a couple of drinks. We'd have snacks, and we both loved speculative fiction. And so we'd like watch something and chat about it, or we'd like watch music videos and talk about how great they were, whatever. We just do sort of all these things and make jokes, and we both have this like the sort of like critical minds that you can't really turn off, so everything you watch you start talking about it. And we were like, and it really did sort of just become, if we record this, we can just laugh at our own jokes over and over.
But what's weird now, looking at it years later, is that at the time we also felt like we were like very isolated indigenous, like we're the only ones who are doing this kind of thing or whatever. And as soon as we started putting episodes out, we were getting feedback from people like all over Canada and the US, who were like, I love Star Trek too, and like da-da-da. And all of a sudden we realized that there's actually a ton of indigenous out there who are like wanted some sort of community. And so, you know, we started meeting, and like I put that in quotation marks because some of these folks we haven't met in person, but like, you know, Johnny J from A Tribe Called Geek, you know, Beth LePonce, you know, we did J.O.J. and we did like a guest podcast on this like Star Trek theme podcast.
Yeah, Women at Warp.
Yeah, that was amazing.
Yeah, and with like some hardcore, like I consider myself like a very devoted Trekkie. Yeah. These people were hardcore, like full on Klingon cosplayers, learned Klingon, hardcore.
It was
Trekkers.
Amazing.
Yeah.
And we're like, wow, there's so many people, and like, you know, older folks and younger folks and like everybody in between, realizing there's actually like this huge amount of indigenous out there. And then all this stuff started coming together. And I'm definitely not saying that we were the catalyst. No. I think we just became aware of it. Yeah. Is like, you know, then you had Indigicon. So much was going on that we became aware of, and it was being in social media and stuff allowed us to talk to folks and collaborate. And yeah, it's just been really super inspiring. There's so much work going on everywhere.
Yeah, and I think too, you know, one of the things that we sort of came to realize is that one of the things that really draws Indigenous people to sort of speculative fiction and nerdery in general is that it allows that sort of prefiguration, right, that we're not really supposed to be allowed to have as Indigenous people. It allows us to think ourselves into this future, right, to imagine, to take up sort of these settler science fiction tropes and to remix them so that they work for us, right, which is something that Indigenous people do with everything, right? So we're not assimilating. Instead, we're not assimilating into settlerisms. Instead, we're taking settlerisms and assimilating them into our own cultures and our own worldviews and our own sense of who we are as peoples, right? And that's what sort of futurisms do.
And not translating for the settler gaze too. A lot of what we do, we don't like, it's our audience is other niches. And so like if white people get anything from that, like who cares? We don't like translate it for them. We're not like feeding them anything. It's not for them. So
I think there's something to be said there too. I mean, I'm thinking a lot about nostalgia because when you said Star Trek, I'm thinking about like hanging out with my family, and that's how we do it. It's all generations hanging out in front of one TV watching Star Trek. I mean, when I was a kid,
that was Next Generation for me.
Yes, when I was a kid, my mom,
it was the highlight of the week.
Right? My mom, she would ask us, okay, kids, do you want to go to the circus or do you want to go to the Star Trek convention? We're like, Star Trek all the way, and she'd buy us Spock ears, and we'd go in our little half-breed ears. It's so awesome. Amazing. But I wonder about that, like, because it's a show that spans the generations too, right? So there's some relationships
and we've
to
heard
that.
from people who their whole community would get together on Sundays to watch Star Trek.
Yeah.
Whoa.
Like, it was like a community thing, right? Like, they would go around and there would be like a couple of houses that they'd go to, but everybody, and that's what they talk about during the week, right? So that's the other thing too, right? Because I think there's this idea that television, especially sort of when television was first starting, that it was one of those individuating technologies.
And alienating, right?
Yeah.
Like,
it's anti-relational, right? There's this idea that TV is anti-relational. It's sort of like part of this neoliberal way of isolating and individualizing our own experiences sort of with media and entertainment and narrative. But you hear stories like this and you realize the opposite is true, right? Things like fandoms, conventions, communities or families all getting together to watch the show. Everybody, and like thinking about like something like Game of Thrones, everybody's talking about Game of Thrones, right? It's a way that you can relate to people. Right? And somebody who doesn't watch it, it's like isolating.
Yeah, you're on the outside. Yeah, totally.
So, I think it's important that we like look at these sorts of media as ways of relating to one another and as community builders, right? And so that becomes part of what makes shows like Chambers, for example, so important because they are Indigenous stories, and it's not just that there's an Indigenous lead; it's an Indigenous story and like Indigenous context, right? Anyway, we did Chambers yesterday. That's
it's so funny because like Molly's the hugest swim, and I'm like I'm only slightly less wimpy, but yeah, I finally got her to watch Chambers.
It was awesome. It was so scary, but so awesome.
Yeah. Oh, I'm gonna have to check that out.
It is so worth it.
Yeah.
Really?
Yeah.
I can't do horror. The Ring Girl ruined me for life.
No. Like like
I love horror. I'm like, yeah.
we also cannot do horror.
Yeah.
So
I just stopped watching Buffy the Vampire Slayer because it was too scary.
yeah.
The only one I can watch is the musical episode.
It is like
so good.
my jam. I'm especially such like a fan of the old school like 1970s slasher flicks. Like
yeah,
I am like bring
more
on the
blood and
chain,
gore, the
like
better.
bring
Yeah.
on the chainsaws. Like the more just throw buckets of blood on. Like
Yeah, I
love
can't.
it.
I can't because I can't
Love
stop
it.
thinking about it. It really,
Oh, yeah.
I get obsessive and it really bothers me.
And I live in an old farmhouse and
my
like
God.
I just
Oh my
really
God.
want to do a
Yeah.
Halloween at my
Why?
place where I have like the chainsaw and just come out of
See,
the
that would
bushes.
probably
like,
be too scary.
I would
for me
literally die.
to
So
go to.
this is
I
not
love
like
it.
that.
Yeah.
You can definitely
Yeah.
watch
I
it.
don't know if I can handle that.
If we could watch it, you could watch it.
Okay.
Watch it. I mean, watch it during the day.
Yeah, that
Put the
helps.
volume down a little bit because I find atmospheric music like it's there to like ramp up the tension. It bothers me a little bit, but
Yeah, and turn on the captions and just
Yep.
And there's not. It's more
not-
just
yeah.
so. I saw Get Out, which was I can't even look at gifs of Get Out. It's so scary, but it reminded me. It's like a lot of what makes Get Out scary is the tension. It's not really that anything scary is necessarily
Yeah.
happening. Nobody's really jumping out at you. It's like not but it's the tension that ramps. In Chambers, it's all about this tension. It's about race tension and class tension
Yes.
and relational
that's
tension.
the horror. Is like
Yeah.
is all of is
Yeah.
the race and class and
I would just give it a watch, and if you need to turn it off, you need to turn it off. But like, it's just so cool seeing an Indigenous woman lead character, young woman who's like has this incredible non-fetishistic sexual agency right from the beginning of the show, and it really is. It's all about her, and she talks. We've done 5 seasons. We've watched dozens, literally dozens and dozens of speculative fiction that deals with Indigenous people. We have never had an Indigenous woman lead character who talks.
it's unbelievable.
No, I'm surprised too. What?
Yeah.
That exists?
I know. Well,
Nice.
this may be the first one.
I know. I'm hoping it's the first of many.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, I think you could argue that something like A Red Girl's Reasoning is
Yeah.
speculative fiction, but it's like 10 minutes long. It should be a feature. But
So would you say that's your favorite episode so far?
Red Girl's Reasoning.
Yeah.
Oh,
Or do you have any favorite
Chambers.
episodes?
Chambers.
Chambers, yeah.
Our favorite episode? I don't know. I've
Lilo and
got
Stitch
a
is
couple.
awesome. I mean, Lilo and
favorites.
Stitch, you could argue, is also about Indigenous women who talk, but it's a Disney movie.
Yeah.
Which then I think it's the context is a little different there.
Yeah.
It's definitely up there for me. I think I mean, we talked about it for
In terms
so
of like
long.
actually being good, like I've got some favorite episodes that were just bad.
Yeah.
but yeah, in terms of like actual representation and being for Native people and versus like telling Native stories that are legible to non-natives, like yeah, I would say this is probably one of the best things
It's
we've
up
seen.
there for sure. And it's interesting too because I think because we've done stuff all the way back to the 60s to contemporary stuff, and I think what we've seen in general is that sort of Indigenous representation, Indigenous narrative and speculative fiction peaks sort of around the late 80s and early 90s.
Yeah, and then
it
gets
starts-
really bad.
Yeah, it
like
just
the
gets worse
aughts,
and
in the
worse again.
aughts, everything
Yeah.
that we saw from the early aughts sucked so bad.
Yeah,
like was super fetishistic, inaccurate, a hodgepodge of like stereotypes.
Yeah, the teepee, wigwam, totem pole, all in the same area sort of
Yeah.
thing. But I think it's interesting, right? Because there is sort of this liberal progression narrative that we're all fed about, society in general, but also about media, that media is becoming more diverse. It's becoming more
Yeah.
representative. New types of stories are being told. But when you actually do the kinds of surveys we've sort of been doing unintentionally, you realize that that's not the case. It really does. It comes in waves.
Yeah.
And you can really sort of trace those things. Like even looking back, even like representation of women, for example, looking back in sort of like the early to mid 90s, you get all these like incredibly badass, strong women who don't need saving in like action. Like I'm thinking about like Sonya Blade in Mortal Kombat, or Melina, who is just like this like disabled sex worker killing cops in this disabled sex worker anti-cop revolution in Total Recall. Like you would never see, or Blade, right?
Yeah,
Like I
yeah.
saw the original Blade recently. I was like, this is the greatest movie of all time.
Yeah.
Like, it's so unapologetically anti-cop with this like dark-skinned black man just like going for it so hard unapologetically, and he lives at the end, right? Like he doesn't become it's like
the martyr.
His tragedy is not because he's anti-cop and like not afraid to show it. It's there's all this other stuff going on, but you don't get those kinds of narratives so much anymore. And like hopefully with Chambers and things like that, we're maybe seeing another shift. But I think it's important to note that it's not this sort of linear progression, and that we do have to keep fighting.
I think that's a big thing, is because and this is true of like Native politics and stuff too, is right, you have like really intense periods of repression and oppression, and then intense like organizing among Indigenous peoples, and then you gain some headway, and then you get funding, and then you get co-opted, and then you get comfortable, and then you work against your own people. And I'm talking about like politics and representation, because you want to maintain the gains that you think you've got, and then the next generation has to go through the struggle again. But this time they're fighting not only, you know, the settler state, they're also fighting the entrenched, previously were activists who are now like kind of like towing the line and fans of incrementalism. You know, you're fighting your own people. And I'm really seeing this too with like, I think this is what has happened a little bit with like cinema, is like, you know, we kind of got a wedge in. There's like a little, you know, there's a few actors and, you know, a few directors and stuff like that, but it's kind of like, you know, the industry is like, all right, that's enough representation. And then it's really hard to like break out of that, right? And if you want to, you're sort of seen as like, you know, you're attacking the people that have been there for a really long time, but that's not really the case. You're just trying to expand things, and do things in different ways, and that can be seen as threatening. I guess it's super frustrating. But that's the thing, is every generation, we have to get out of this narrative that we're ever going to be able to just, you know, like coast along. Like we have, every generation has to fight. It's a new fight every time. And not only does every generation have to fight, they also have to fight the generation that came before them.
Yeah. And I think that's really important, because I think, so now that I'm like in my 30s and sort of realizing that, like, you know, there's stuff that young people are doing now that I don't really understand.
Yeah.
And like, that's okay. And I don't really understand why they're doing it. And I don't need to necessarily, right? Like I would like to, but I don't need to. But I think the most important thing that we can do as sort of we're all getting a little bit older is be able to not only make space for these young people to do work that for us maybe seems inexplicable or seems scary or whatever, but that we support them in it. Right? Because I think, you know, I recently heard the term FRUMP, which is formerly radical upwardly mobile professor.
What?
It is like, such a thing, though. It is such a thing.
I can think of so many people, and I'm just right now I'm just like terrified that I'm
becoming
going that route, right? Because, you know, for the first time in my life, I can afford things like rent and food at the same time all the time, right? And I don't necessarily have to work, right? And so it's like you feel yourself getting comfortable. You feel yourself.
That's how it happens with politics and everything.
And it happens, and it happens if you work for the city. It happens if you work for Indigenous organizations, right? You get comfortable,
and then you get scared.
And that fire starts getting a little bit doused.
You don't want to go without it.
Yeah, you don't want to go back to that precarity. Right. But that precarity, I think, in a lot of ways, and it's sad, right? Because we shouldn't have to feel precarity in order to feel motivated. Motivated, but I think, that precarity it lights a fire under you. And the young people, and especially under neoliberalism, right, young people are realizing that, you know, opportunities are shrinking, right? And I think we all know that opportunities are shrinking too, so we want to hold on to it so desperately. But I think, as Chelsea was saying, in our fight to hold on to our comfort and our stability, or what little bit of stability the state is currently offering us,
we get in the way. Or we can actively become the, you know, gatekeepers, or like the people who are stopping young folks from doing what they need to do to survive, even. Like, and that's what's so scary too, is I think a lot of that, you know, I was talking about how we, you know, there's this wedge that sort of opened up in Indigenous, you know, in filmmaking and stuff like that, but that it's everywhere, right? And so there's this idea that, you know, what we have access to is a pie, and once you start taking slices out, there's less for everybody. It's this scarcity model that we all work from, because that's the model that that is administered for us, and it can make us cliquish, it can make us jealous, it can make us violent towards one another, because we start feeling threatened when other people are taking up spaces that we feel are like, it's our space and it's the only space we have. And I think that what Molly and I really feel strongly about, not like, this is why we're saying too, we reject apocalypse and we reject scarcity. That is not a model that is in any way liberatory. It's not gonna create futures for us. We have to open that model up and make sure that we're continuing to make space, and space is infinite. We can continue to make space and not run out of space.
And I think the other thing too is there's also this myth that like the rising tide raises all boats, which I think is also something that we really have to be critical of, because what we see instead is that it's sort of the state and sort of the actors of the state, rather than raising all boats, rather than making everything and everyone more acceptable within sort of like, you know, liberal narratives of tolerance and inclusion, blah, blah, blah. Instead, we see shifting goalposts, right? So it becomes, after the TRC, it became more acceptable to be outspoken and Indigenous. But what that actually means, and what we kind of see that actually means, is there's certain types of art and poetry and expression that become acceptable, and others that remain unacceptable or become more unacceptable.
Yes.
Right? There are certain types of Indigenous people that become acceptable in the mainstream, but it gets re-entrenched that other people are bad, deviant, wrong. And, and it really is sort of that genocidal narrative, but the focus gets shifted, right? And so it's like, when we become sort of like part of the privileged mainstream, even if it's still marginal, I'm not saying that we're not still marginal, we definitely are. But again, we want to hold on to that, and we don't pay attention to these other people over here that are facing increased repression, right? So when we are doing work, especially narrative work, I think it's really, really important that or not activist work or whatever you want to call it, right? It's really, really important that we don't just think about ourselves, our own families, or even our own nations. We really, really need to start thinking about, from a sovereignty perspective, if this is our land, and if we really believe that we're the ones who should be deciding what occurs on our own lands, we need to be thinking about everybody that lives here.
Yeah, which often just means white settlers, but
it should mean the opposite of white settlers.
That's exactly it. It's always, there's this like two nation narrative, like Indigenous people as a homogenous whole, and then white people. But really, it's like no, we want to focus on like Black communities of color, all of these people who are deliberately set up by white supremacist settler colonialism to be also vying under that scarcity model with us, right? So we're always like at odds with these other people, and all of us are trying to speak directly to the white settler. Well, fuck that. Let's like not talk to the white settler at all. Let's talk to each other and like stop that.
Yeah, that's why I think that metaphor that you were talking about it's very crucial, because you said a rising tide raises all boats, right? But large waves sink small ships, right? So if a bunch of different small ships band together, then there's no way that wave can destroy you. A flotilla. There you go.
An armada.
Try sink us now.
But I do. I think that's really important, right? Because I really see that sort of in this fight, and you see it even among Indigenous peoples, right? The sort of like First Nations versus Métis versus Inuit, like all of that BS, right? And the ways in which we harm each other because we're all fighting for this, what we see as sort of these like infinitesimal resources that we're getting or whatever, right? Like, we also need to think about it, I think, from a global perspective, right? Because even though we suffer under colonialism, we also benefit from it. And I think we need to be more upfront about the ways in which we do that, right? Like the imperialism and neocolonialism that's happening in the Southern Hemisphere, for example, we directly benefit from that, right? But we never talk about that. We never talk about the ways in which we can start forming alliances with people down there in order to create new ways of living and being together.
We do talk about that, and some of that is happening. Like, I know for years and years, like even back in the 90s, there were like Mapuche delegations who were coming up to meet with the Cree, the Lubicon, and stuff like that. So there are, a lot of that relationship building has been ongoing for decades and isn't necessarily like online. So it is happening, but it's also very specific, because there's certain people that are considered Indigenous, and then indigeneity in Africa, for example, is often like not discussed, or people are like, it's too complex, and so it's like Africa is like left out of global indigeneity, and so indigeneity is like the Americas and Australia and New Zealand and a few other places, but like meanwhile, like we have not been very good at making connections with other Indigenous peoples, and I think that's kind of where hopefully things are going to be going now.
And also just going to becoming more of a priority. Like you said, sort of decentering the settler from the work that we do.
Yeah, and I understand like that need, and it's sort of that shift towards refusal for state recognition and all that. But it's just, if you have this is the thing too, is like, I think young folks, like, and I'm thinking about myself when I was younger too, is it's really important to have a sense of history of Indian organizing, like throughout the generations, because you do see things happening over and over and over again, and the gains made are so fucking small that you're like, wait a minute, like, or
it goes backwards.
It does. It often, and
you
that's
make
the thing.
Tiny gains, but you lose so much,
and it claws back every time. Section 35, woo, claw back. Like Supreme Court decisions like Marshall, clawback. Like that happens over and over again. And at some point, without disrespecting the work that has been done before, because those people worked their butts off and they experienced a lot of violence and they really, really believed, without disrespecting that work, just being aware of it. And even having these people tell us, like some of the older people are saying like, hey, we did this and we're in these spaces again. And honestly, we don't see much change. So why are we repeating that? And I think a lot of that is the focus on always trying to build bridges with people and invest so much community energy. How many times do we pour our hearts out to this settler state to try to get them to see us as human beings? And there's a surge of sympathy for a while, and then they're back to fucking us over. Not even back to, because they never stop. Right? So every generation has to struggle, and we have to find new tactics. And if we don't understand what's come before, then we're just going to keep repeating these sort of we're going to keep believing that we can just humanize ourselves into liberation. But the oppressor is never going to see us as humans, because it goes against their sense of humanity, which is very exclusive. I can only be human if other people are not.
And I guess to bring it back to Métis in space, the other side of that, or I guess it's the same side, right, is that we also need to be able to envision these futures for ourselves. We need to be able to put ourselves into these narratives that we're going to be here, we're always going to be here. And that's, I like it because it resists settler assumptions of Indigenous disappearance without needing to put all of our attention onto them, which I think is that's kind of the important work. How do we continue to be resistant, to be subversive without centering what it is the settlers are necessarily doing to us? Instead, we're centering what we want to see, our own shit, how we want to relate to other people, how other people want to relate to us, right? And I think part of what we're trying to do with our world building aspect of Métis in space is to say, offer one vision, and it's a cheesy vision, it's like a original Star Trek space babes,
totally.
Tinfoil, dressing a dog in a costume and calling it an alien,
it's
sort
awesome.
of, that kind of future, but it is sort of doing that work. What kinds of technologies do we get to have? What kinds of societies do we build? What kinds of badass fashion do we have? What kinds of problems will we face and how will we address them? Right? That's, to me, sort of the best of speculative fiction, is that you're thrown into this situation. The norms are different, the trappings are different, the environment's different, but fundamentally the issues are the same. So how do we build novel solutions to them?
Well, you could even say, outside of the content of your podcast, of course, even just your production decisions is resistance, right? So you're not getting funded by major parties, you're not
we include the
changing
family.
Including the family, not going crazy on the production value. That's the thing. You're holding your ground, and I think that's really important and really admirable for sure.
And that being said, I'm thinking about folks like Rick Harp, who does Media Indigena, who does take, he has a Patreon, he's not taking it's not like he's taking oil money or anything, but he does that part-time. He's only working part-time right now because he's so committed to this project. And he has some of that experience, right? He has broadcasting experience and all of that. So, he's able to make something that is production, and he's able to spend a lot of hours on every episode and all of this, and I really respect him for doing that.
But we couldn't do that. We're honoring what we bring to the table, which is no money smarts, no interest in doing a massive side hustle around Métis in space, wanting to center joy.
We've talked about it a couple of times, and we both sort of decided that it really wasn't for us. But I want to make it clear that there's lots of different ways of going about this kind of thing, and there's people doing it in other ways that are still
which is totally
good,
fine.
important work.
We've been talking about Media Indigena. Rick Harp, I love that podcast. Not to bash us or anything, but he's an Indigenous man, right? This is an Indigenous Métis women production. We do things differently, man. Totally differently. So I don't know if you can even compare the two.
That being said, though, I hesitate to be he's an Indigenous man, so he does it this way, because I don't want to shut down if there are other Indigenous women and other Métis women who say, I want to do it that way. Full-time. I want to put in my time and my energy. I'm all for that. If you want to do that, fucking go for it. It doesn't, it doesn't mean that you're doing it in a way that's non-Indigenous or not, enough of being an Indigenous woman or an Indigenous feminist. But I do recognize that the specificities, do tend to be gendered, right? And the types of energy that you're able to put towards something, it does really depend on, your family obligations and where you're coming from and all of that.
Yeah, and that's what I'm thinking, of families and including your family into the podcast experience, right? Because you have a life outside of this podcast. Not saying that he doesn't. So I don't.
I don't really have a life, honestly.
Go ahead.
I think And the thing about, like, we've been trying to discuss what we're going to do for season 2, if there's even going to be a season 2. I hope there is, a bookwoman, but also just, like, the logistics of doing that. And we're all, except for, like, Tanya, who's a PhD student, that's a different amount of labor than Sheila. I don't even know what Sheila's doing right now. Sheilah's living her life. So, but, like, for me, like, working a full-time job for the Ivory Tower, like, you know, it takes a lot to do this kind of stuff, but I've been really enjoying it. And I think one of the big things too is that we're giving back to our community members. Like, we tried not to get a lot of individuals, because I know that there was a period of time where it's like you had to have this person presenting at your conference or giving this talk, but we're trying to involve individuals who maybe don't get to have like their voices heard, or even going out to community. And that's what I'm hoping like season 2 can look a little bit more like, is because we have gone to just people's homes and hung out with them and have like the experience of, you know, running around after their dogs and kids. And I think that's what's been really meaningful about this podcast, but also just like looking forward to next season possibly, and how we can give back to the community more and kind of get more individuals.
Well, that's the thing, like a podcast, the recording is just the recording, but it's everything outside of that. It's the relationships that you two have made with all the people and guests coming in too, right? So well, I guess, and too, like, even the relationships, like, people that are listening to you all the time, kind of, like, the unknown relationships about maybe those listeners who listen to, like, every single one, because I know when
some
we had...
outside of Canada, even. We had, like, some weird ones. Like, Norway and stuff,
Which is sweet.
I took one of our new interns on a tour of Native Studies, and I just pointed out, like, your office, because I was just showing them around the basement, and they got so excited. I listen to Métis in Space all the time, and I was like, oh, that's their office.
It's actually really interesting too that you sort of bring up that relationality that you have with listeners, because so I know when the first time I talked to Ryan, it was on the phone. I'd never met him before, but I'd listened to his podcast so much, and I found myself almost really having to reel myself back from being like, Ryan, how's it going? How are the girls? Like, how's your life? Right? And I was like, I don't actually know this person. But apparently when you listen to somebody's voice, you do it, like, in your brain, it's like you've met them. It's like you actually know them. And it's like this physiological thing. So we've experienced it, and I'm sure you will as well, where you'll run into people who really act very, very familiar, even though they've never met you before. And the first few times it happens, it's really
super weird.
Sort of like off-putting.
Especially because we do put details in our pod, like we talk about our lives and stuff. And so people are learning, like we are sort of intimate, but we don't necessarily know who we're being intimate with. So like when that comes up, when somebody is like, they know things about you, you're like, what?
I actually, so I really like Red Man Laughing, and I think I've openly said that I like to listen to it while I'm working, because Ryan has like a very soothing voice. And it's not, because I've listened to some podcasts and I just can't do it, because like the voice is too, like, someone's voice is too shrill, or like it's too soft, and I'm just like, this is boring. But I had this really like funny moment. I think Tanya was there, so Ryan started following me on Twitter, and I was like, I can quit working now for the rest of my life. Like, Ryan McMahon is following me on Twitter. Like,
so funny.
My life is complete. But I was just like, because I listened to Red Man Laughing, and I really enjoy like Indian Cowboy, most of the podcasts that are on there. So. But you just get this familiarity with somebody because you're just listening to them all the time. And it's almost like, you know, you're their next door neighbor or something.
But that's why I think it would be great. Like, I definitely love, like, one of my favorite podcasts that he did was when he went to the Hyde working camp. And so he's like getting like aunties, or, you know, the Kokums there are just like, you're a weakling. You know, and just like, but hearing, you know, folks talk and being in a natural setting and doing what they do, and just like him being sort of like the fly on the wall, the annoying little, like, what are you doing, fly on the wall. Like, I love that kind of stuff, because like it really does give you feel like you're in that space. And so like being able to have, I think, podcasts in community and doing things like that, or talking to folks like you're saying in their home, opens up spaces for us in ways that like maybe we don't have as much, because not everybody, like there's so many more urban natives, you know, like, and that is a bit isolating. People are not going and visiting as much as they used to. And so if we can have kind of those visits in other ways, I think that's really important, because we are becoming sort of more atomized. So
and I think like that was one of the things when we went to Lac St. Anne, because Tanya and I went, I was helping with a research project that she's working on, doing genealogies, and hanging out and getting paid for it was kind of nice. But I got to go out there, and I think one of my like favorite memories is just sitting down with cookums and mushums that are just, they want to know about their families that maybe they don't know. And a lot of the times it was because of mobility issues, or it was really hot when we were out there, they would just come under our research tent and like sit in a chair next to me, and I'd whip out the census from 1901 and we'd explore it together. But I think that kind of building relationship too is like really important. So I don't know, maybe we'll have to take Bookwoman on tour and head out to back to Batoche, because I know we're going to be going next year.
Yeah, next year.
Have to do a live on location.
Yeah.
Even at Lac St. Anne, like there's so many great stories that we heard just by sitting down and talking to people.
Well, I tried like for a while saying, oh yeah, the Bookwomen are on the road, come check us out in Jasper, but nobody came and said hi to us because we're not famous enough.
We're more famous than we are, less famous.
Most of the times we were just getting heckled when we were in Jasper, but that's another thing.
When was
when we
that?
were at that conference. When we went to the
totally
the conference we go to every year.
Oh, that one. Yeah.
But that's
Different
okay.
story.
Those are librarians.
Oh, yeah.
That's a different thing.
But I really love what you said about that, right? Because I think there is this sort of idea about sort of reciprocity in relationships that I think podcasting as a medium can really explode, right? I think like we all agree that you're in relation with your audience, you're in relation with your listeners, but that doesn't always look like we're creating this content and you're going to give back to us by listening to it, right? Like it's not, that's not what that is, right? Instead, I think, you know, what Chelsea was sort of referring to with sort of this rise of the indigenous community and people finding one another is when people listen to podcasts, you know, they start relating to you, they hopefully, you know, take some ideas from you, or at least they find some value in what you're doing, but hopefully then they take that and they put that out there into the world in different ways. And I think that's a really important way of understanding reciprocity, is reciprocity doesn't necessarily come directly back to you. And
it can be spread out. Like
what the value of those relationships
We're all
are.
Inspiring each other to do, like I definitely, had we not encountered all these people doing these amazing projects, even Métis in Space, the way that we think about it would be very different, you know? So like there, and you don't always know what's like sinking into your brain and like coming out, right? And we try to have like, you know, radical citational politics where we try to really acknowledge the fact that like we're not coming up with things in isolation. It's coming from so many different places. But yeah, like just as those linkages are made, it's a cascading situation. It's not just like, it's not a two-way reciprocity.
It's more of an ecology of relations.
A constellation, as it were.
Yes.
A beautiful constellation.
Yeah, and so like we've ended up getting involved in projects that have nothing to do with science fiction, but based out of sort of the work that we do. And it is directly connected, but we, you know, it becomes this whole spider web of sort of relations that bring us places and bring people sort of to us, and you know, we all just are sort of moving around in all these amazing ways, and hopefully all providing value to one another in different ways, and making things better and easier in general, sort of among Indigenous people and other, you know, people that we want to get in relation with, good relation. And, you know, I think that that's a really interesting thing to think about, sort of both as a mechanism of publishing. Why do we publish? What is the value of publishing? What is the value of making content and putting it out there? But also sort of in general, how do we want to live with one another, right? Because I feel like there's this idea, and I know that we talked about this when we were in PhD class together, we all talked about it, was sort of this idea that reciprocity is transactional, which doesn't sit well with me. I think that reciprocity, we need to understand it as something that's more expansive. And I think that podcasting as a medium and just publishing in general is a way of doing that, and we don't necessarily need to map it either, because I think we all agree that it exists, right? Like that kind of reciprocal relationality that is really expansive and outward facing does exist. Tracing it or mapping it isn't necessarily the most important thing, right? Just putting the stuff out there and letting it grow and become its own thing, I think is it.
Well, even still, like reciprocity is not on a linear timeline either. Exactly. Reciprocity can come back 30 years from now, you know, and that's okay.
And we laugh sometimes about like how future historians will view our work, but it's because that's all we figured would happen, like, because again we didn't expect anybody to listen to us. The weirdest thing has been that some people are studying us now, and so, you know, even reading some of their conclusions about our work is hilarious, because like they read intentions.
So fancy.
Yeah, they read intentions into what we do that aren't necessarily there, or methods that aren't necessarily there. And yet, you know, it's interesting because like once they start interpreting it that way, like it does sort of become reality. And yeah, anyway.
Yeah, we're like, oh yeah, we are doing
sure,
it. Yeah,
100%.
Definitely.
How did you know my theoretical approach?
All right, my internal clock is saying that that's enough. Like I feel like we've hit.
We have hit it.
All right.
Yeah.
Wow, your
Yeah.
internal clock's great.
It
know, it's
actually
weird.
is. Can I squeak in one last question?
100%.
Sure.
So this question obviously is for the listeners, for, I don't know, people who want to do podcasts or anything like that. Could you give them any piece of advice on how to get that ball rolling?
Just do it.
Just do the thing.
Yeah.
Do the thing is our number one piece of advice for basically anything that people want to do. Like,
You don't even have to buy like a fancy microphone anymore. Everybody has a really good microphone on their phone.
like
We're
as we
recording
see
on
right now.
phones
Yeah.
right now.
Yeah.
Yes, we are.
Seriously,
I would
just
say,
like
that.
don't overthink it.
Yep.
Like you don't have to. It doesn't have to be perfect. Just like treat it as a relationship, as a conversation. You can be as niche as you want.
Yeah.
You know, like absolutely anything that you can think of. You know, you might believe that you're the only person out there who is really into 19th century cookware, but I guarantee you are not. You will find a community.
I'm trying to think if there's anything else. Oh, also we do have some resources on our website. I haven't been able to track down Ryan's Red Men Laughing How to Podcast, but Chelsea has a really, really good short podcast series that she did on how to build a podcast. I think it's 4 episodes?
Yep.
And it's on our SoundCloud.
Okay.
It's on the Métis Space SoundCloud. So if
Yeah.
people want to get started podcasting,
Yeah.
Chelsea's a great teacher, so it's really, really accessible, really easy to figure out. And yeah, I would say do the thing, especially, if you're Indigenous and especially if you're an Indigenous, like not cis guy, like we need your voice, whatever, that 19th century kitchenware podcast.
From
like,
a
that
trans
is,
perspective.
yeah, that is gonna,
I would listen to that like all the time.
Totally, let's get out there, right? There's sort of, podcasting still tends to be very cis male dominated, and that is so boring.
Oh my God, yeah.
So get out there, do the thing. Like, we need more Indigenous voices out there.
It is
Awesome.
Yeah, keep it fun. I think that's the other thing.
Yes.
That actually maybe is the most important.
It is
piece of
definitely the
advice
most
because,
important.
we're talking about the half-breed hustle. It's real. Neoliberalism is real. The gig economy, precarity, austerity, all of that is so real. But, in this rush to monetize everything, in this rush to professionalize everything, we forget that things can and should be fun. So
And generative.
Yeah. So if you
Yeah.
can, and I know not everybody can, try to make it something that you do for fun.
Yeah.
That's it.
Perfect.
All
Then
right.
I'll take this opportunity to thank you, Chelsea and Molly, for joining us today, or I guess this nice sunny morning.
We will link in for this episode how to access all the Cowboy and Indian podcasts. So definitely take a listen to them because they're great. And then also some tips on podcasting for everyone. So I think that's it for this episode. We are almost done season 1 of Book Women.
Yeah, a couple more episodes
Yeah,
left.
a couple more episodes. So definitely take a look out for them. Maybe we'll see everyone for season 2. I don't know. But hi, Marcy, and be good to each other, and catch you next time.